Introducing Alex Cox, Director of Threat Intelligence at LastPass.
That's it.
How are you, brother?
I'm good, man. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Flown in from?
Charlotte, North Carolina.
Okay, Cool. What RSA is this for you then?
11. So I actually used to work for RSA, so I went like 10 years in a row. So.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, nice. When did you finish with RSA then?
So that was 2 jobs ago, so like 6, 7 years.
Yeah, sweet. Okay, cool. Well, let's dive straight back into where it all began, man.
Oh, sure.
Got into the industry. So where did it all start for you?
Yeah, no problem. So I actually had a pretty interesting, like, circuitous route into cyber. I went to college for criminal justice and to be a cop. Actually, I wanted to be an FBI agent. And as happens, I met a girl and ended up marrying that girl and decided to, put roots in Richmond, Virginia. And I was a cop for about 3 years, a local cop for about 3 years. Decided that policing wasn't for me long term. What I found was that I just didn't really have the personality that meshed well with law enforcement. So, I was a computer hobbyist and I kind of got into computers and, I started thinking about maybe I can switch careers. And the thing that really pushed me into IT work was I had a buddy who I taught computers to, and he had no knowledge of computers. We were in the Army together. And he went out and got a job, and he came to me, he's like, hey man, I just got this job making this amount of money. And I was like, dude, that's like twice what I make as a cop, and I taught you everything you know. So I started thinking about it more and talked to the wife and eventually said, okay, I'm going to leave policing, I'm going to go into IT. Went into IT, got a job on a help desk, worked on a help desk for a while, ended up moving to Wachovia, the bank, before Wells Fargo acquired them. And while I was doing that, I got deployed in the Army. So I was in the reserves. I was a military officer in the reserves. I got deployed in the Army, stateside. I went and worked for a year in Missouri at the military police school. One of my coworkers was going through grad school at the time, and he was doing a remote grad school program. And I started thinking about it, and I'm like, I can do that. Like, I want to get a graduate degree. I can do that. So I went back to school for information security because I wanted to get into cyber at that point, and I had been doing some cyber work already around malware and AV, antivirus. So I got my degree. That kind of got me the first cyber job, and I've just really enjoyed it. So at Wachovia, I did we called it the emerging threat team, and it was a team that looked at what was coming, what are the things we need to worry about, longer term, and how can we address them. So it was like cyber threat intel before threat intel was really a career field. Yeah. And I was doing malware analysis at the time when there was only probably a few hundred people worldwide that were doing it. So very early in the malware space, and did that for a while. We ended up working with a technology called NetWitness, which you may be familiar with. And I ended up taking a job at NetWitness. I was employee number 40 there. They were very much in the startup space, again, doing the same type of work. And while I was at NetWitness, just through my daily work, I discovered this really huge botnet, and we started mapping it, and then we, talked about it, and the press picked it up, and that was my 15 minutes of fame. Like, I was in all the major newspapers. We were number 2 on Google. Interviews right and left. So it was a really fun time. But again, that sort of gave me a name. So NetWitness got acquired by RSA. And then I took the work I was doing at NetWitness, transitioned it to RSA, again in the threat intel space, again in that emerging threat space. And it was largely around creating content for NetWitness, so what we would call detection engineering these days. Back then it was just figuring stuff out. So we were building content for the NetWitness product. Again, NetWitness acquired by RSA. RSA was an EMC property. EMC then got acquired by Dell. So I basically went from bank to startup to security firm to bigger security firm to mega giant technology firm, and then I decided to go to Bank of America. I said, I'm gonna leave the vendor space, go back to defender land, and I was hired at Bank of America to run their threat intel program. So was a threat intel executive at Bank of America for about 5 or 6 years, and then the current CTO of LastPass, who was a former boss of mine at the bank, Chris Hoff. He called me up and he was like, hey, we need a threat intel guy. You want to come work for me again? And I was like, yeah, man, that'd be awesome. Let's do it. So that landed me at LastPass. And the biggest challenge I had really at LastPass is how do you take, so the bank spent like $1 billion a year on security, and I had this monstrous threat intel team of 40 people that could do anything we needed to. The resource difference between a mega bank and a small, technology firm or security firm is very different. So, figuring out how to scale that down to the point where we can still do what we need to do, has been a really fun and challenging part of working for LastPass.
A quick one here from Oliver, one of the co-founders of Asperon Search. Our CyberBytes podcast showcases the security ecosystem's most exciting companies, but we do much more. Our talent solutions give security vendors the competitive advantage by building high-performing go-to-market and technical teams globally. If you're looking for your next role or need to hire the best talent in this competitive market, then reach out to us directly via our info@email in the show notes. Let's get back to it.
Love it. Before we get into your LastPass role, obviously law enforcement, military, it does seem like there's a lot of folks do make that transition from military law enforcement into security.
Yeah.
Why is that like?
So the way I explain it is people that are cops and people that are in the military typically tend to be the run towards gunfire kind of people. Like, I want to help solve hard problems and help people. And you'll find that cyber has some of that same approach where, and I was telling people earlier that a lot of the folks in cyber, and especially folks in threat intel, view our jobs as protecting the internet. It's not just about protecting our company. It's about, like, how can we make the internet better? How can we make the internet safer? And the camaraderie and the relationships you build there are very similar to the ones you build in the stressful situations that you're involved with in the military and law enforcement. And I think that lifestyle tends to attract veterans. Being a veteran myself, I love hiring veterans because I know that under pressure they're going to probably be okay. Especially in certain areas. Like special operations guys, I love hiring those guys because they're amazing. Anybody that's in any sort of ground combat role is usually pretty solid when it comes to capabilities. But it just makes for that shared experience to help build the relationship, and being able to deal with these stressful situations that we do is just a natural fit.
Yeah, I love it.
Yeah.
What about your current role at LastPass? What are you doing there? What are your responsibilities?
Yeah, so I'm the director of threat intelligence there. We call the team TIME, and that stands for Threat Intelligence Mitigation and Escalation. So if you look at holistically at the job, it's largely around keeping track of the threat environment. And the analogy I typically use is, if I'm going to build a house, I'm not just going to show up and say, all right, we're going to build a house. Like, I got to buy equipment, I have to buy materials, I have to have a plan, I have to understand what the buyer wants, et cetera, et cetera. And the work involved there is very similar to threat intelligence because I'm doing the same sort of thing. Like, who are the bad guys? Why are they after us? What tools do they use? What are the tactics, techniques, and procedures? What are the IOCs we need to understand? And all of that work sort of centralizes in the threat intel space for us at LastPass and my team is like, let's understand what's going on in the world. And I think a lot of people miss that, and especially the smaller companies, because maybe they don't have the resources that have like a dedicated threat intel team, but they're really just throwing darts in the dark to try to protect their stuff. They bring their equipment up, bring their IT infrastructure up. Maybe they secure it to whatever standard that the company asks them to, but it's never totally effective because they don't have that understanding of the bad guys. So the threat intel piece is super important. So for mitigation, that's like, okay, something's happening and we have knowledge to help, from a threat intel standpoint. Like, maybe there's an attacker going after somebody and we go, oh, I've dealt with this guy before, this group before, this is what they do, look for this, right? We can mitigate their attack in that way, break the kill chain, as we typically say. And then the escalation piece is the other thing. Okay, so we're monitoring the threat environment, we understand what's going on in the world, we see something similar, let's make sure we pay attention to it or escalate it to the place where it needs to be addressed. So it's a pretty wide-ranging.
Threats now, because obviously over your career, it must have evolved like massively.
Oh yeah.
What are some of the threats now in comparison to before?
Yeah, so the way I typically explain it, especially on the cybercrime space, is that these cyber criminals are entrepreneurial and opportunistic. So they look at, what are the easiest ways for me to make money? Like, okay, here's a new technology. How can I use it to make money? The AI thing is great, right? It's a perfect example because the AI stormed the industry, and all you hear now is AI. And the way we've seen it used with the bad guys is tooling their phishing to be better. So historically, when I'm looking at a phishing attack and I try to detect a phishing attack, understanding use of the English language is important there. And because a lot of these cybercrime guys are Eastern European and English isn't their first language, you can go, that isn't spelled right, the grammar isn't right, something's weird, this is not right. Now enter ChatGPT, I can say, write me a phishing email or write me an email to this person about such and such, and it creates a very believable, native English speaking looking phishing email. Send it off, good to go, right? So the evolution, tactically from the way these guys are operating is really interesting because they very much watch the technology space and they understand when this technology is going to give them advantage, and then they use it. The other thing that they do is they pay attention to what the defenders are doing. And I was telling somebody earlier, when I'm doing threat intel work, there's a tremendous amount of back and forth that happens behind the scenes between researchers, even at different companies. And that's largely because any one researcher has one piece of the puzzle and typically can't see the rest of it, but another researcher might see a different part. So when we work together, we get that big piece, or the big picture of the puzzle. So that sort of interaction with the industry is super important. And realistically, the way it works is because the bad guys are paying attention. If I then publish some research and they see that, the bad guys will go, oh, they're on to switch to something else. Okay, now we've lost visibility as to what they're doing, and we have to kind of start over. So you see a lot of hacks and breaches and stuff not talked about until very late in the game when there's been a whole bunch of active activity previously. And that is for that reason, because we're trying to get this stuff on law enforcement's desks so they can then address it with law enforcement and fix things, but we can't let the bad guys know that we're doing it, because then they change and we lose the visibility. So it's a really interesting tie-in between cyber and disruption from a bad guy perspective, and how we can manage to do that. But yeah, you're absolutely right. Watching the way they've changed tactics over time and gotten better, and it's all monetized now, and yeah, it's really interesting.
You mentioned a lot of cross collaborations with other research and stuff. I was going to ask how do you stay up to date with the threats that are coming up? Stuff with governments and things as well.
Yeah, I mean, so you typically build relationships with companies in your own industry, and then companies outside of your industry. Maybe some intelligence community, maybe some law enforcement, although those places tend to be one way, right? You send them info, they go, thanks, and off you go. But it's gotten better. Like the FBI is great now about collaboration with industry. We don't do a tremendous amount of work with the FBI, but I have in the past, and I've seen over time that it's gotten way better. And then the other thing is there are a lot of researcher communities where researchers gather and talk. So like I'm a member of a number of researcher-only communities where threat intel pros just talk about stuff. And the advantage there is when I need somebody at another company, and we talked about this earlier, I can go, oh, I know a dude from Google. I need to talk to somebody from Google. Let me go, hey man, I need some help. So that's super advantageous. And then, conferences, coming here and talking and making sure I'm making those connections all help. So yeah, there's a whole lot of cross collaboration that happens in various ways kind of behind the scenes.
Yeah, you mentioned researchers. I know you did a recent report that came out, like a research report, LastPass. What were some of the key takeaways from that activity?
That was the SMB report?
Yes,
yeah,
correct.
Yeah. So, I think the biggest takeaway there was that there is some disconnect between the way that executives and managers view their security program and the reality of actually how the security program is operating. Because what we found is that a lot of senior management types say, oh yeah, we're good. And then a lot of the folks that are kind of on the ground are like, we're not as good as you think, maybe not so much. And then also that there is some variation in age generation, that determines how people operate. Like we found that, the baby boomer generation and Generation Z are more likely to write passwords down, whereas Gen X and the millennials are less likely to do so. And, the way I explain that is, if you look at Generation X, which I'm a member of, and you look at the millennial generation, a lot of the technology, social media and stuff that we use, Gen X built, right? And the millennial generation improved upon. So they have this understanding of technology that maybe the newer folks that are really good at using one of these, but maybe not so good at the old school kind of technology work, I think plays a part there. So the management disconnect and then the generational thing, I think, was one of the most interesting for me.
Yeah, there are a few myths around password security in general, and passwords that people use. I think people even using password as their password.
Oh yeah.
Is that true? How much truth is that?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. That's one of the challenges. If you look at base security practice, and one of the things that we tell people, if you only do 3 things to secure your stuff: patch your machines. When you see a patch pop up, patch it. Use individual passwords for every single site you use. Don't reuse your passwords. Make sure they're complex. And then use a password manager so you don't have to try to remember or write these things down. And those 3 things, will protect you in a lot of the cases, because, if I look at the exploit landscape, a lot of the vulnerabilities and exploits that are used to get into places are 18 months old, right? These companies have had tons of time to patch them, and maybe they just haven't. The password reuse thing is also huge. The bad guys know that the average person, uses a password that's easy to remember, and then they use it everywhere, right? So when I breach a small, website that is maybe not very well known, that password may be the same as the one you use for your Gmail account. I get into your Gmail account, and I have access to all your stuff now, right? Because I can do password resets and all that jazz. So it's a really interesting approach to that sort of basic cyber hygiene that leads into bigger things if you don't take care of it. And the password place is right there. The other thing I'd mention there is, so I was reading an interview with H.D. Moore probably a decade or more ago. So if H.D. Moore wrote Metasploit, right? He's a Metasploit developer. And somebody asked him, what's the most common thing you use to hack into things? And he said, social engineering. Like, I don't really even use technical hacks anymore. I just talk to people. And, so that's the other thing, is like understanding that guy that calls you and says, hey, can you do this, may not be who you think it is, and make sure you understand that, and that, if something is coming to you out of band or in a way that's unusual that you haven't seen before, question it, even if it's from somebody so that's another interesting approach.
Yeah, I love it. So talk about hacks, elephant in the room. I know I met someone on the plane that worked for LastPass and said, what questions shall I ask Alex on the interview? And she said to me that you should ask him about the security that you guys have put in since last year. Specifically, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, so I can't so much talk about the technical side, but one thing I will say is that when Hoff hired me, he asked me to, and because I had some experience with this, like, we need to communicate to the world that LastPass knows security, right? And I need your help to do that. So a lot of the blog work that we're doing with LastPass Labs is around that, like, hey, we're paying attention to what's going on in the world. Here's what you need to know. Here are some things that are very interesting. Here's our, our thought leadership, or how we're approaching a certain problem. Here's what we think about AI. Here's what we think about this recent breach. And what I'd say is that has already made a pretty measurable difference. I mean, me being here is a great example. I don't know that I would have been, 2 years ago. So being able to talk about just security in general is a big part of that threat intel piece. And like I said, it's so important that you have that threat intel piece, because it really guides you to know where to secure things and where your program needs to go.
Yeah, love it. So what's the future for LastPass then, Alex?
I mean, we're going to keep doing the things we're doing, keep talking and keep doing the password thing. I think largely, from my perspective, as long as I can keep talking about the things that are important, from a threat standpoint, I think we're doing well. I mean, the fact that I can come and do things like this, and I can talk to people and, make people understand from my perspective is huge. So more of that. Yeah, more of that.
Well, thanks for coming on the show, bro.
Yeah, I appreciate it, man.
Bad guys out.
Yeah, appreciate it.
Love it.
Yeah.
Thanks, mate.
Sure.
Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this very special RSA Conference 2024 edition. If you did, then please like, subscribe, and of course share with your colleagues and friends. If you're a candidate looking for your next role, or a hiring manager looking to build out your technical or go-to-market team, then please reach out to me directly on LinkedIn or via our email, info@aspironsearch.com.